All right, hello everyone. My name is Yinka, and this is a PicoClaw setup guide. One that actually works, honestly. A couple days ago, about 5 days ago, I ran a live stream. Actually, I ran a live stream setting PicoClaw up, trying to set PicoClaw up on my VPS, and it wasn't the easiest of process, right? And this was right at the peak of the whole OpenClaw killers, ZeroClaw, PicoClaw, TinyClaw, NanoClaw, and a bunch of them. And it was really exciting because I recently got a Raspberry Pi and I wanted to set up OpenClaw on the Raspberry Pi. But I had concerns with like the specifications of the hardware, if it was going to be, a good decision, right? And sure enough, these OpenClaw killers were all over the internet. And I was like, oh, this is fun. This should be fun, right? I'm going to try one of these to see how well they perform. And I hadn't gotten my Raspberry Pi at the time, but I had a VPS that I had lying around, and I tried to set up these OpenClaw alternatives. I started with ZeroClaw, and it looked promising, honestly. And then, like at the top of the setup process, it just fell apart. It didn't work. And this was while I was live streaming the entire process, right? And the documentation was crap. There wasn't much I could do with that. And then I had to pivot to trying out PicoClaw, right? PicoClaw also, had very not so great setup process, and it left so much to be desired. However, I was able to figure it out, right? And this was like 5 days ago. I think it was Sunday night, if I remember correctly, or Saturday, I can't remember for sure. So I did set up PicoClaw. I had it on Telegram, and I was trying to chat with the agent, just work with the agent and figure out if it was a good alternative to OpenClaw. It wasn't. Like, long story short, it was not a good alternative to OpenClaw for a bunch of reasons, and we'll get into that as the video progresses. However, it's been 5 days since I tried PicoClaw, and the setup process was exhausting. And then a couple days ago, actually today, a couple hours ago, I wanted to reinstall PicoClaw to figure out how much of a difference there is between PicoClaw and OpenClaw, right? Because I've got my Raspberry Pi, I had the OpenClaw set up, and I had my agent all set up. But I wanted to figure out how much of a difference there were, weighing them side by side. And the setup process was still so difficult. It was just really difficult, and it made no sense to me. And the last pull request that was merged was about a couple hours ago. So I would assume that some work has been done to the README file and it was better, but it wasn't. And so I have taken it upon myself to walk you through an actual PicoClaw setup guide that actually works. I promise you this works 100% of the time. And I'm fixing the documentation gap so you don't have to. So if you're curious about PicoClaw, you want to set it up, you have a very cheap hardware, Raspberry Pi or whatever it may be, PicoClaw, you can set it up and it'll work fine. I'll show you that it actually works, right? Okay, so what exactly is PicoClaw? We went over that at the beginning. It's a lightweight AI agent that runs on practically anything. Raspberry Pi, old Android phones, cheap VPSs, pretty much the same LLMs but a fraction of the resources, right? It takes less than 10 megabytes of RAM, it takes less than a second to boot up, 25 MB binary size, and the tagline is the $10 hardware. So I currently do have PicoClaw running on a VPS. The VPS cost me about $4.5 per month, so it's not a huge deal. But the specifications are fairly impressive. It's a 4 gig RAM. No, it's an 8 gig RAM. I'll put it here. I can't remember what this. But it's an relatively impressive VPS that is running my OpenClaw instance pretty well. Well, a version of my OpenClaw instance pretty well. Now, how do you get PicoClaw up and running so it actually works? I'm writing an article for this. I'll leave the link to that in the description and you can follow that step by step. But I recommend that you follow the pre-built binary file so you get the latest, you run these set of commands and you should be good, right? Now, alternatively, you could just build it from the source, which is you clone the repository, you build, you install. But I followed the alternative path the first time and it just was very inconsistent and never really quite worked for me. However, the actual bottleneck was in the config file. In this latest release, that is, in the config file, and it was just confusing because PicoClaw, for whatever reason, has two config files, two config folders and then two config files, right? They had one inside of the GitHub repository, and then they have another one that is created when you run PicoClaw on board, right? And whenever you make modifications to your model, your API keys and everything in between, it still messes up. So ignore the config file in the GitHub repository. It doesn't work. That's not what's going to get you what you need. Run and edit the config file in the PicoClaw instance that is created when you run PicoClaw on board. So that is the actual one that matters. Another bottleneck that was really, really confusing was how PicoClaw worked with the model names, the model provider, and the API keys, right? So you're going to need both a providers block and a model list block in your config. The docs imply that you only need one. So it just tells you that you need one and not both of them. So yes, you do need both of them, your providers block and your model list block. The thing is, in the config file that exists in the GitHub repository, it does have both, but that doesn't work. PicoClaw doesn't read off of that. So we're going to need both. We're going to make the modification to both in our config file, which is the one inside of the .PicoClaw instance. So you're going to duplicate your API keys in both places. That's currently what we need to do. So your providers block tells the agents which provider to use, and your model list is where the model lookup actually happens, right? So in my case, I'm currently making use of OpenRouter. So your model provider will be OpenRouter. So you're going to have your API key there, and you're going to have your API base. And then your model list will be, the model you want to make use of inside of OpenRouter. For me, I currently do make use of, I think I make use of Kimike 2.5 inside of OpenRouter. So you're just going to have the model name and then the model. And whenever you're inserting the model, you're going to ensure that you have the name of the organization, the company, and then the model name, right? As you can see here, OpenAI GPT-4o. For Kimike 2.5, it'll be Moonshot Kimike 2.5. For Minimax, for example, it'll be Minimax and then M2.5, right? Minimax M2.5. So these are very crucial because if you miss them, your OpenClaw configuration isn't going to work, right? So ensure that you follow these steps. You create a providers block and a model list block, and that is going to set up your config, and you should be good. Once that is done and you save your config file, you can run the PicoClaw agent, which is a message, and then you type out your message. It should work really well. If you get an error, if you miss anything, or if you have weird syntax, your error would actually point out to where the syntax is at. So you could just walk your way backwards and fix that. And if you get these errors, error creating provider, no API key, you forgot your model list entry, invalid authentication, your API key is wrong or expired, model not found, then it could be a model mismatch, model name mismatch, and so on and so forth. So with this, you follow these steps, you have PicoClaw up and running on your terminal. However, you'd like to make use of it on Telegram, on Slack, or whatever it may be. I had mine set up on Telegram, and the integration is pretty straightforward. You head over to bot father on Telegram, create a new bot, copy the bot token, get your user ID, and you're going to go ahead and add the channels.telegram block in your config. Again, the article will have all of this actual step and the code example, so you see what you need to do. And it'll be very, very straightforward and a lot more intuitive, I promise you. However, if you do want to run both of them together, you can, and you just have to split the ports. You can have OpenClaw running on a particular port and PicoClaw running on another, and you can have both your agents in two different telegrams, chatting with them, interacting with them. If you're trying to understand which is better for which task, and then you can delegate X to Y accordingly. Now, this is what the documentation doesn't particularly tell you. You do need both the providers and the model list. It misses this because it makes the assumption that this already exists in the config file that is in the GitHub repository, in the GitHub folder, repository folder, right? The model list entry also needs your API key. The config in the repo is not used at runtime. Model names must match exactly. Two instances need different Telegram bots. And number 5 is irrelevant to the context of PicoClaw, but is unique to my situation because I'm running both OpenClaw and PicoClaw in the same VPS instance. And OpenRouter is the most reliable provider. I say this because on my OpenClaw instance, I have Kimike 2.5 running, not the Moonshot API key, the actual API key from the subscriptions. Kimi gives you an API key even though you purchase the subscription, not necessarily the API key. And that works really well on OpenClaw. Actually, it's currently my main model of choice. However, if you're working with PicoClaw, OpenRouter is the most reliable provider. So, stick to that and you shouldn't have any issues. So they do have pretty much the same mission, but different tools, if you will. Yeah, PicoClaw isn't trying to replace OpenClaw, and I don't think it can. PicoClaw lacks a bunch of features that you can see in the documentation, and I'll have that in the article as well. Obviously, for one, it's headless. It doesn't have a UI that you can look into and work with. So if this saved you hours, it did save me. It would have saved me a ton of time. Feel free to share. However, let me just spin up to the terminal view and show you how this actually works. This is my terminal. I do have, as you can see, I do have OpenClaw and I do have PicoClaw, both of them running side by side. So if I were to send a text to test out my PicoClaw instance, as you can see, this is a response back from the agent, and these are the logs from that conversation. Now, if we head over to the GitHub repository, you'll also see this config folder. This is the one I'm telling you that you should completely ignore. This, whatever modification you make here, PicoClaw doesn't pick it up at runtime. And if you stick to making modifications here, it's just going to be a frustrating experience. So ignore this config file, the config file inside this folder. Now, as you can see this hidden folder, that is where we're going to make the modification. So we're going to cd into that. And this is the config.json file. And we're just going to nano. My API key is definitely going to be exposed, so I'm going to have to blur that out. But this is what it'll look like. Your provider, you set the provider of choice, you create a model list, you set your model list, your model of choice, and that's pretty much it. So once you have this going, in here, my current PicoClaw instance is making use of GPT-4o. You can make modifications here directly, so it knows which model to work with if you have a different model in mind. And once we're done, we're just going to close that out and then run PicoClaw, and we're good to go. Now my PicoClaw instance is actually working, and this is what it looks like on Telegram. You can see that. Who are you? It's actually a lot faster now than the last time I was using it, which is great. And I guess that's something to actually consider. It seems much quicker than, OpenClaw. So anyway, this is it. This is pretty much how you get it up and running. Again, the actual README guide honestly was really confusing to me. It just never really worked. It wasn't seamless. And yeah, thank you for watching. If this was helpful, give it a like, share it, and I'll be making more videos like this, setting up PicoClaw, AI, crypto, Web3, software development, building with AI, and all of that cool stuff. If that is something you're into, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so very much for watching. Peace.